Human existence has been the central question for centuries of philosophical inquiry, but in the modern era, the emphasis has shifted from being in communion to a focus on the isolated self. Saint Dumitru Stăniloae, a brilliant Orthodox theologian, critiques this modern philosophical shift, arguing that existence can only be understood through communion, not through isolated thought. I think, therefore I am. These words, René Descartes tried to build an indubitable foundation for knowledge by starting with doubt. By doubting everything but the existence of the self, Descartes concluded that thinking is the only certain truth. But is this a sufficient foundation for reality? Stăniloae argues that Descartes' method, while seeking certainty, ultimately leads to self-imposed isolation. Descartes' philosophy relies entirely on the individual's capacity for reason and doubt, which leads to a self-referential worldview. As Stăniloae puts it, the self isolated from communion becomes an empty abstraction, incapable of understanding reality as it truly is. Furthermore, as Stăniloae says, when the human person closes in on himself, he ceases to be a person. He becomes a solitary individual, lost in abstraction. Descartes believed that by starting with the self, he could build a rational system of knowledge, but this method fails to account for the communal nature of existence. We are not solitary beings, but persons created to be in relationship. As Stăniloae emphasizes, to be a person is to be in communion. Only in relation to others does one truly become who they are. Kant believed that reason was insufficient to grasp what he called the thing in itself. Quoting what Kant said, "Thoughts without content are empty. Institutions without concepts are blind." Kant's division is self-limiting, but drawing such a rigid line between what can and cannot be known through reason, he leaves humanity unable to encounter the divine except through moral postulates. But Stăniloae challenges this view, arguing that Kant's skepticism about our capacity to know God ignores the transformative power of faith. Reason cannot ascend to the divine by itself, but faith opens the path to communion. In communion, the human person encounters the living God, not as an abstraction, but as a personal, loving being. Kant's reason imprisons us within the limits of our own minds, leaving us disconnected from divine reality. Stăniloae's response is clear. Only faith can transcend these boundaries and bring us into communion with God. Unlike Kant, who saw the nominal as an unreachable horizon, Stăniloae believes that through faith, we participate in the energies of God, experiencing his presence directly. Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher of nihilism, took this isolation to its extreme. Nietzsche believed that humanity was thrown into an abyss of meaninglessness, where the individual must create their own values. But this radical individualism, as Stăniloae argues, leads not to freedom but to existential despair. Stăniloae critiques Nietzsche's existential isolation, pointing out that without communion with God or others, the human person is left in a state of meaninglessness. He writes, "Man without God is a being without center. He creates and destroys his own meaning, never finding true peace." Moreover, Stăniloae quotes, "The human person in rejecting communion with God sinks into existential despair, for true freedom is not found in isolation, but in the love that binds us to the divine and to others." Where Descartes, Kant and Nietzsche fall short is in their inability to account for relational existence. Descartes retreats into the self, Kant limits knowledge to the mind, and Nietzsche rejects all higher meaning. But Stăniloae offers an answer that transcends these limitations. For him, human existence is not solitary, it is communal. We are created in the image of God, who is Trinity, Father, Son and Holy Spirit, eternally in communion. God is not a solitary being. The Father knows himself through the Son, and the Son through the Father, in the unity of the Holy Spirit. This is the model of human existence, as Stăniloae writes. The human person, made in the image of the triune God, only becomes truly himself in the context of communion. Isolation leads to death, but communion is life. Moreover, quoting Stăniloae, "Communion with God and with others is the fulfillment of human life. Apart from this, we cannot find the true meaning of existence." Philosophy, when cut off from faith, falls into self-contradiction. Descartes' self-referential thought collapses into a loop where the self explains the self but never escapes its own tautology. Kant's skepticism, while acknowledging the limits of reason, closes the door to transcendent truth. Nietzsche's nihilism results in a void where meaning is constructed and deconstructed endlessly. As Stăniloae rightly observes, self-referential reasoning like Descartes' ends in tautology. It explains nothing. Truth, however, is found in relation, where the self is open to the other. He critiques the idea that certainty can be grounded in the self alone. The isolated self is an empty abstraction, whereas the true knowledge is relational. Moreover, quoting Stăniloae, A is not explained by A. A explains itself through B. In communion, we escape this isolation of self-reference, discovering truth in the relationship with the other. Faith for Stăniloae is not irrational, it is the gateway to communion where the limitations of isolated reason are transcended. Philosophy, when it denies this relational truth, ultimately fails to account for the fullness of human existence. As Stăniloae argues, the path of doubt ends in the contradiction, but the path of faith opens in the mystery of divine love. In communion with God, we find not only meaning but life itself.